Hello, everybody. Welcome to, I think it's the first day of March. Yes, the first day of Women's History Month. But I think Women's History Month is perhaps an American thing, and it's only the 1st of March in Australia for me right now. It may be the 1st of March by some definitions in parts of Europe, and definitely in parts of Southeast Asia, and I'm not sure if they have the concept of a Women's History Month, but I do hope that whether it's based on like calendar or decree, that people in all parts of the world, regardless of the date and time, are, I want to say, giving ashe to the influence of women on history, and also giving ashe to, I'm going to say, like stories or historias that will revere the influence of women far more than current time history. But welcome to the March 1st container of Why Am I Like This? If you've never tuned in before, thank you for tuning in for the first time. If you're here live, thank you for being here live and offering your presence and your questions to this container. I'll say, Why Am I Like This is a container where I channel the consciousness of Sirius C, which is a star that some people believe already exists, and some people believe does not exist, and some people believe will exist at some point. And all those people may have different cosmovisions and also different definitions of what it means for something to exist. And some of those definitions may pertain to different definitions of materiality or empirical verifiability in our realm. But I'll say that from my perspective, I'm channeling the perspective of Sirius C, or an astral being I know as Red Star Green Cloud, or Nobu the Elder in this container. And it's a container where I ask for offerings of questions which are usually posed to me outside of the container of Why Am I Like This, which I feel I can only adequately respond to, which is to say that I can only respond to in a way which creates cosmos rather than creating chaos within the containment of this container that I call Why Am I Like This, within the containment of the 000 lineage space, within the containment of the Broom Radio. And I'm thankful for especially the people who contribute live to the containment of all of those containers. And I'll say what I usually say at the beginning of this container, which is that my guarantee for this container and all containers of Why Am I Like This is that no context will be enmeshed, and that context will be disenmeshed, and that I will hold space for good faith feedback or offerings of refinement or repair with regard to my guarantee or with regard to the container in general. And for this container, I'm feeling called to bring in 3 different questions. And 2 of them seem like more clearly related, and one of them feels very, very auspicious and spicy, but not so clearly related, although I'm beginning to see the relational dynamic with more clarity as I spend more time in this container. And I'll also offer that if you want to visualize or otherwise, I want to say, access with clear senses what I mean when I talk about first, like the container of this question, which comes from a tender of the broom named Lexi. And the question is, how do you feel about enlightenment? And you can kind of access that with clear senses, or you can just access it with the non-clear senses. which I guess you're probably doing already by listening to me speak. But yes, the first container is how do you feel about an enlightenment? And then the second container contains a question which comes from a former member of the broom, Maxim, Eeyore, or Divinity does. And the question is, what comes after ripening / deconditioning / enlightenment as windows into the same process? And you can see how those two containers relate and are perhaps connected within your awareness. And if you feel called to, and you feel like you have the skill and the capacity, you can see if there's anything to clear about those containers in your awareness so that you can see how those containers might relate or take form in consensus reality. But in a consensus reality which is inclusive of material consensus reality, but also inclusive of immaterial consensus reality. And then if you like, you can also use your clear senses and whatever processes of alchemy or transmutation, or I'll say diffusion, which you feel like you have the skill and or the capacity to enact, to gain a perception of the container of what I'll call consensus, immaterial, and material reality. And then I'll invite you to situate all of these containers inside the container of this 2024 March 1st container of why am I like this, like this, like this. And then you can also put into that container a question, and I'm just like preparing my vessel to make this container, but I'll call it, what are signs that I have observed relating to metaphysical burglary, or I'll say akashic pillaging, and what are some concrete examples of this in relation to your own ancestral akash. And then if you feel cold and applying all of the preconditions which I've stated already, you can situate all of those containers and the container of the March 1st, 2024 episode of Why Am I Like This inside a container of Why Am I Like This outside of this space and time. And you can situate that within a container which includes a lineage space called 000. And then you can situate that within, I'll call it, a container called the broom. And Julie is offering green jelly, lavender, and lace agate outside of this container. Thank you for those offerings. And I'll say, I only allow what is for the cosmic time, and I'm bringing forth a light language and spirit tongue transmission from Hanumanji, Levantara, the group consciousness of Cetus, the group consciousness of Blue Avia, and Nobu the Elder, on the topic of, I'll say gentle deveiling, and I'll start now. Mataro satafte peru kanat ene satafte peru tataftamat atakanastor tsatilek halat koroma sataftanamashi hateme okara safte pele kataramasit oro hatanifte peru konarishta hatebe kadasta kedemutulen kotorashta kanamasati elifte purupa katadera katanashtare tekenem eno korata tiara tsakona balakadishto haltere tuonesta tanipiteri tutaya karata kiara masum karishto ter konamsa naso nikederta karata timeturushta satana katuparchana tekaleso shtanelna karata shtuk katasana niteram ala sanako sanakoreka kiana kiana sanakoro koreka kiana kiana sadi korikana kora kiala kiala sanara niala kora sana kora kia 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 ma 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 ma, 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 I also want to give ashe to a question that Ahmed um, posed in a container that we call, I believe it was Sharia Way container, regarding the goddess Sekhmet. And there were some other really juicy aspects to that question, which I asked Ahmed if he would like to bring into the container of why am I like this. And I was kind of thinking I might bring that container into this container of why am I like this. But I didn't get an affirmative response in time. And I'm not sure if an affirmative response has been given, not to put any pressure on you, Ahmed, but thank you for being here. But that question seems really juicy, and I'm looking at my tattoo of the goddess Sekhmet right now, and she's like, figuratively speaking, in my inner vision, like just like tapping the table, just like waiting, because it is a really juicy question, and I can't wait to answer it. If you do choose to offer it to the container of why am I like this, and if you choose not to, then I'll probably come up with what would be comparatively a pretty shitty answer, I think. So if you want a really good answer to this question, then please offer it to the container of why am I like this. Or you can settle for like the suboptimal knockdown model of the response to that question. All right, cool. I'll push the buttons to bring it into why am I like this later, but thank y'all for being patient while I channeled from call it like the group consciousness of my vaster self. And yeah, I'm very curious how I'm going to weave a response to these questions, which in some ways feel quite disparate. But instead of just like fucking around and thinking about it, I'm just going to keep talking and we'll see what happens. So, metaphysical burglary, I think, is a really interesting formulation of the question from Julie, because the exact words, to be fair to Julie, um, were metaphysical robbery, and I believe that was in the original formulation of a question which I've posted in the container of why am I like this. And I don't feel called to mention some of the names which are mentioned in that question, but I'll say that the question, and I'll say this somewhat cheekily, refers to experiences of metaphysical robbery by certain spiritual practitioners who I would say are fairly prominent um, online, and I would say also in the collective consciousness of humanity. Um, but without going further than that, I'll say that the formulation um, of this question using the words metaphysical burglary is conspicuous to me because I feel like there's a way in which the egregore of the word robbery implies something which is slightly different to burglary, at least for me. So I think that it's possible for robberies to occur which are in the interests of cosmic time. And I'm kind of thinking about Robin Hood, let's say, robbing from the rich. Literally, I think, right? Robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. Whereas I feel like, again, for me, the egregore of burglary does not afford space for the idea of cosmic time being enacted via theft. But please disagree. I just had to close the door because somebody outside was being very loud. Hoda says, I feel like there's a textural difference. Thank you. And I think that also implies that in the original formulation of the question regarding, I'll say, akashic pillaging and I'll say astral theft, that some of that dispossession, I'll call it, some of that dispossession can be made cosmic through the way that we respond to that situation. I'm going to read out a definition that Julie shared. No one has to be in the building or vehicle for burglary charges to be pressed. A robbery, on the other hand, always occurs with the victim present. That's very interesting and it feels pertinent for me. Adam says, all in context. That's very interesting. So, yeah, I feel like this is a useful definition. I won't say that like it overrides like the definition that I just put forth. Some people may believe that burglary can be an enactment of cosmic time. That's fine. I think hopefully it's clear, but if it's not, I'll make it clear again that I don't expect anybody else to adopt my definitions, but I also don't feel, and in fact, I would say I don't feel the need not to say how things are defined for myself. And I'll also say I feel the need to say how I define these things just so I can communicate more clearly. And, some people might find my methods of communication arduous, but at least in these contexts, I would prefer to be accurate, even if it means not being brief. So I'll just say again that for me, metaphysical robbery can be an enactment of cosmic time. I would say that acts of metaphysical burglary can be folded into cosmic time, but I don't feel like they necessarily occur with cosmos behind them. And I wouldn't say that all robberies also occur with cosmic intention or cosmic energy behind them, but I would say that some of them can. And then I'll borrow from the definition that Julie put forth about robbery requiring a victim to be present, whereas burglary doesn't necessarily require a victim to be present. And I'll fold this into what I want to say about my feelings on enlightenment or ripening or deconditioning. So, in this container, I'll say that some of the experiences of metaphysical burglary that I want to talk about on my spiritual path fit the definitions that I put forth just above, I'm going to say, in this container, which is to say that I don't believe that I was present by some definition of the word present, which is to say that I believe that these thefts occurred due to my lack of refinement and my lack of integration. And in that sense, because the aspects of myself which were, I'll say, burgled in these experiences were not connected fully to the aspects of myself that I was embodying in the time when these burglaries occurred. You could say, quote, nobody was home, unquote. And you could also say that my awareness was not able to flow into these aspects of myself. And therefore, certain spiritual practitioners who are fairly prominent on the internet and in the collective of human consciousness were able to come into these aspects of myself while nobody was home and pillage these aspects of myself from my perspective, which I would say like now includes these aspects of myself or aspects of those aspects of myself, such that I am able to perceive how this happened. And I feel like it's perhaps complex to talk about how this unfolded in linear time, because I'll say that, to borrow a phrase that I believe Hoda first introduced to me, and which I feel like was reinforced by Lexi's invocation of it, one way of thinking of aspects of self or fragments of spirit or parts of soul, as different lineages call them, or some people kind of refer to the same thing when they're talking about inner child parts as an example or a more specific case of fragments of spirit or fragments of soul. But the phrase that I believe Hoda introduced to me and Lexi reinforced is, quote, reservoirs of time, unquote. And I would say that when these reservoirs of time are integrated, the time that I'm in my current time, or you could say any moment embodiment of self, then those times are joined. And then the perception of time from that embodiment of self, which I would say is expanded to include that fragment of self or fragment of soul or reservoir of time, changes. But of course, that integration of that reservoir of time happens at a moment in time. And in that sense, I would say like a traditional model of how time works, and I would say like a particularly linear model of how time works, has to like bend a little bit to understand um, time from that renewed and expanded perspective. And I'll say that in recounting my experience of metaphysical burglary, and I'll just use one example. Hopefully, I can illustrate this without it being too confusing. I was quoting a song that's playing at a store, which says, "Go easy on me, baby. I was just a child." So, the way I'm going to recount this starts, I would say, in early 2022. And I would say that at the time I was driving around in the deserts of Arizona. I think I was traveling south to north at the time. So from the low desert to the high desert, you might say. And I had to pull over at some point because my channel was just like crazy lit. And I would say that what was coming through my channel from my current perspective in time was a lot of karma relating to ruptures that had occurred due to metaphysical burglary. But at that moment in time, all I knew was that I had to pull over my vehicle because I felt nauseous. And I pulled over by the side of, I'd say, like the main freeway, which runs like south to north, north to south in Arizona. And there were lots of cows there. And I went over to pray to the cows. And I took a coffee that I had felt called to purchase. And I situated it right in the middle of a pile of cow dung, and then I performed a ritual while moving around this pile of cow dung and a cup of coffee. And I feel like some of y'all and some of the people who might listen to this asynchronously are familiar with rituals of exorcism, um, and or familiar with this particular ritual of exorcism, which relates to using black coffee and sometimes salt, sometimes sea salt, maybe sometimes honey or sugar, depending on the spirits that one works with, in order to exercise. I'd say that, like, from my sense, it works both for what I would call like um, the swapping of etheric souls, or like the removal of etheric souls from corporeal vessels, and the transportation of those souls to what I would call like prison planets, or I'll say like hermetically sealed pockets of space and time, which I believe are reserved for keeping other souls safe from miscreant etheric souls while they decide whether or not they want to align with cosmic time. But these rituals, I'll say, are also useful for dismembering thought forms which are attached to spirits, which I believe are, as I've said in the past, and why am I like this containers, basically like fabrics of space and time, which are, I'll say, like woven from souls, which are of a corporeal or an etheric nature. Which is to say that thought forms get attached to fabrics of space and time, and then they contort weavings of space and time via accumulations of karma. And these rituals can be used to dismember these thought forms and return those fabrics of space and time, to, I would say, like less karmically obstructed emanations of etheric and corporeal souls. And I would say that, like, through the remembering of past weavings or contexts of space and time, etheric and corporeal souls and souls that belong to life forms can reweave those fabrics of space and time, and therefore integrate so-called reservoirs of time, or fragments of self and fragments of parts of souls. Um, and call I would say that what I'm gesturing at now metaphysically, and I would say offering to the container metaphysically, and also articulating physically by making sounds which represent words, which represent concepts, is a process which is also gestured at in distorted ways, and was perhaps originally gestured at in less distorted ways by words like, quote, enlightenment, unquote, or words like ripening and deconditioning. Or to just offer the picture to this container of why am I like this, of a car which has the license plate, and the license plate just says chi. But yeah, I guess I'm gonna like hold space to see if anything else comes up, be it questions, clarifications, reflections, or pictures of metaphysical license plates, metaphysically themed license plates. I also want to give Ashe to a question that Adam offered yesterday, which is what is the Taoist perspective on maintaining one's inner fire, which I think relates directly to what some people call cultivation of chi, or I would say, like, in the Hakka dialects, which my earth ancestors use, it relates to the cultivation of ki, which is also, I believe, the word that is used in the Japanese language for what I'll call interconnected awareness. But that's just like a sneak preview of that container within the container of why am I like this. But so to go back to this like somewhat linear narrative of time, it was early 2022. I was dancing around a pile of cow shit, which had a cup of coffee situated in the middle of it. And I felt like I was exercising not only etheric souls, which have taken the heart space or Indra Sutra in corporeal vessels, which belong to spiritual practitioners, which are fairly prominent on the internet, but also in collective human consciousness in current time, which is now, which is when you're listening to this problem. But it's definitely like when I'm recording it. And I was also using this cup of coffee and this cow shit, which contains a significant amount of genetic material, which I would say is spiritually powerful for reasons I won't explicate right now. I was also using the coffee and the cow shit to remove thought forms or veils from my spirit. And I would call this one example of a process of enlightenment. And I'll also relate this to recovering or integrating reservoirs of time or fragments of self. And the way that I'll relate this to what's gestured at by words like deconditioning and ripening and enlightenment, which seem like in some ways, I would say geometrically polarized, is that when it comes to enlightenment, I'll say that like the thought forms which were attached to my spirit, which veiled me from collecting these reservoirs of time or like integrating these fragments of myself, are sometimes also referred to as parts burdens within the framework of internal family systems. And you could say that like detaching these thought forms is like removing these parts burdens so these different parts can become harmonious parts or integrated parts. And I feel like invoking the language of parts burdens connects this process to what's gestured at by the term enlightenment. In the sense that without the burden of this karmic obstruction, my spirit is lighter and more integrated. And I think the connection to like deconditioning is also like pretty clear when I explain that what's being removed is a karmic obstruction. And when I say that like karmic obstructions usually arise from conditioning, which either causes trauma or occurs after or in relation to trauma, which is to say that disorganized energy ends up taking a geometry, usually of a thought form or a behavioral pattern, which is connected to thought forms, and therefore organized energy can become disorganized by that conditioning, or it can become disorganized by trauma. And then rather than becoming organized, which I would say invokes parlance, which is used in relation to life forms and bodily organs and bodies, say rather than becoming organized, that energy becomes contoured or conditioned. And I would say that exercising these thought forms, removing these karmic obstructions, also relates to deconditioning from that perspective. And then when it comes to ripening, as a term which gestures at what I believe is like more or less the same process, which I'll call like integration. Um, the way I'll relate that to what I've already said is that, I feel like it's more difficult, but um, if you think about like ripening in the context of fruit, I would say that ripening occurs due to the influence of aspects like sunlight and also like water, which are external inputs which are required for what I'll call like the computation or the explication of the genetic code of a life form. And the way I'll liken this to what I've said previously about enlightenment or integrating reservoirs of time or fragments of self is that I feel like probably most of us who have been like traveling spiritual paths or engaging with spiritual material for a while, something that most of us have probably encountered is the idea of what some people call cosmic blueprints, or the idea that everything is the way it has to be. And I think it's a really tricky idea when we view that idea within the context of a given envelope of space and time. But I feel like it becomes more tractable when we view our reality as a pocket of space and time inside another pocket of space and time. So you can view like what happens on Earth as something which happens within the space time, which is created on a particular timeline of a celestial object, which is the Earth, which is also a gravitational body. And I would say that that gravitational body creates many possibility planes. And within those possibility planes, we have many choice lines. And then within those choice lines, we have many timelines. And then through the realization of possibility and the unconscious or conscious making of choices, in particular moments, we enact certain timelines. And on those timelines, things like metaphysical burglary occur. And hopefully, I'm furnishing the container with enough terma so what I'm saying makes a little bit more sense, or makes sense on some scale of time. Which is to say, also, I believe that, it's not that like the time which actually becomes actual on a given timeline is the only timeline which exists within these fields of timelines and choice lines and possibility planes, which are created by space-time objects, which arise because of gravitational bodies in the cosmos. Which is, again, not to say that we don't have choices to make, and which is not to like bypass the choices that certain spiritual practitioners have made within these timelines. But it is to say that I would say that a particular karmic context, which is, I would say, like offered to a container like Earth, could be described as sort of like a function or a computational function. And I want to give Ashe to a conversation that I had with somebody called @SlimePriestess on Twitter, because I'm invoking some of the words that they used, and I feel like I'm invoking some of the terms and the terma which were exchanged in that conversation. Uh, I would say that on all of the timelines within the choice lines, within the possibility planes, which arise within a given fabric of space and time, which arises due to a gravitational body in the cosmos, you could say that, quote, solutions, unquote, to that cosmic function arise, which are a fit for the karmic context which is supplied to that celestial body. And to make it a little more concrete in a way which may seem like super abstract, I'll invoke like this idea that like various extraterrestrial consciousnesses have supplied their genetic code to our Earth and created different lineages of life forms, including humans, so that they can learn in what some people in so-called like starseed communities often call like Earth School, right? You could say that when they supply their genetic code to this celestial body, then they're also supplying the karmic context which comes with that genetic code, which does allow for the proliferation of different life forms, but also creates proliferation of behavior that those life forms are, like you could say, karmically encoded to play out through their navigation of time, within timelines, within choice lines, within possibility planes, within space-time fabrics, within gravitational bodies such as Earth. And to bring it back to the topic of ripening and how it relates to enlightenment and deconditioning, I'll say that for any given life form, let's say like my vessel, as the product of these different lineages, which are represented by genetic code of a corporeal nature, which I'll call DNA, which I often refer to as like earth ancestry and earth ancestral karma, and also genetic code of an etheric nature, um, which I often refer to as like sky ancestral lineage or sky ancestral karma. This vessel needs to go through certain experiences, aka take in certain amounts of light and other inputs like water, and also um, interactions with pollinators and all kinds of like juicy natural interactions in order to ripen. But there's like a shit ton of variation in how much light I need to take, like whether that light comes from like a fluorescent lamp, or if it comes from an unobstructed view of the sun, or whether it comes from a partially shaded view of the sun, whether I take in a lot of water, whether I'm fertilized with, um, let's say, biodynamic compost, or if I'm fertilized with chemicals. That's all going to lead to a different ripening. And you could say that all of these different ripenings are solutions to that karmic function, which is defined by genetic code of etheric and corporeal forms. Which is to say, in short, that I would have ripened my karma regardless. It is my sense in this lifetime, and it could have been ripened way more sweetly if these spiritual practitioners hadn't like metaphysically burgled me. And to go back to what I was saying again, without naming these spiritual practitioners, I'll say that it was my experience that I pulled over on the side of the road. I felt nauseous. I had felt called to buy a cup of coffee and place it in a pile of cow dung. And then I danced around this pile of cow dung and coffee in order to, I'll say, dial in to ritual containers involving black coffee and genetic material in order to like use the portals represented by the genetic code of that genetic material to call in, I'll say, like mostly earthly spirits, and to use the astral portal of black coffee and salt in order to transport parts burdens or karmic obstructions as well as etheric souls to places where they can be safely contained or dismembered so that my spirit could integrate these reservoirs of time and also shed weight and become more enlightened, um, to become less conditioned or deconditioned, and also to become ripened in a particular way. And I'll say that egregorically, I'd say enlightenment is often thought of as like a one and done process, or like a stage that one goes beyond, which is then complete. And this is not at all the way I see like deconditioning or ripening or enlightenment. I feel like enlightenment is a constant process, and even when we've deconditioned ourselves of like the karma that we've accumulated in our present lifetimes, then there is karma that we can decondition from ourselves or ripen in our earth ancestral lineages. And there's karma that we can decondition ourselves of or ripen in our sky ancestral lineages. And I'll say that like there's karma that we can't ripen while we're in the bodies that we're in, because the way that our bodies function such that we are able to maintain a constant perception of selfhood are themselves karmic accumulations, which I don't believe on some level it would be cosmic for us to decondition ourselves from. And I'm just going to like shield the concept of like death or transition of spirit, or I'm going to shield the process of ascension and the conjoining of, I'll say, karmically lightened spirits so that they rejoin the selfhoods from which they come from, which is to say, like the reservoirs of the lifetimes those spirits are integrated into vaster self aspects of the one. And I'll say that if we were to like decondition ourselves entirely, then there is a bunch of intelligence and there's a bunch of beauty that the cosmos would not have the opportunity to ripen or compute, because there is like, I think I would say, in our time, in the space time of Earth, and in our lifetimes as life forms which come from lineages which are like vaguely gestured at by the word human, it's cosmic for us to maintain the aspects of our body which allow us to embody parts of self in separation, so that we can, in this and like slightly like less obtrusive modes of separation, compute intelligence and beauty on behalf of the consciousness of the gravitational body, which I call Pangaya or Tiamat Gaia or Earth. And that probably a lot of suffering would occur if we were to decondition ourselves from our human form such that we experience selfhood with vastly less separation. And that suffering would create karmic functions which obstruct the process of the computation or the ripening of beauty and intelligence within our envelope of space and time. So hopefully this substantiates my perspective that the idea of enlightenment as this one and done transitional process is egregoric and distorted and does not reflect a particular perspective of a particular reality. And hopefully it substantiates my perspective that enlightenment's a continuous process that I don't feel like most of us are able to or meant to, quote, complete, unquote, or quote, perfect, unquote, within our current lifetime, because it would basically result in an undifferentiated space-time, like a dumb space-time, like a space-time which is too easy to be intelligent or beautiful, and not simple in a way which comes from refinement or computation or ripening. Um, and to bring it back to me dancing around a pile of cow shit, um, I'll say that to Julie's question about how do you identify metaphysical robbery, or what I formulated is how do you identify metaphysical burglary, I'll say that afterwards, like after this ritual and after these reservoirs of time or fragments of self had been integrated, first of all, I'll say I no longer felt nauseous. Secondly, I'll say that like my channel felt more sinuous or more fluid and more able to embody the volume that it had been embodying before when a bunch of this karma was coming through it. But I no longer felt sick and I no longer felt disembodied. I felt more connected to Earth. And what I know now, having integrated further reservoirs of time or fragments of self, is that instead of like some excitation in my field causing me to mostly channel things from astral realms, I was able to connect to the cosmos through Earth, through having cleared a bunch of stuff which related to my Earth ancestral karma. Um, and what I'll say about that karma, which I was also able to observe after integrating these reservoirs of time, is that it was my sense that in so-called past lives of some of the spiritual practitioners I had contact with, and I'll say past lives of my vessel, there had been interactions between what I'll call incarnations of the same etheric soul complexes that my spiritual practitioners are connected to via their etheric souls in their corporeal vessels or their bodies. And my etheric soul complex, as it was connected to my incarnation and incarnations of my earth ancestors, which is to say that some of these spiritual practitioners and their sky ancestors had interactions with some of my sky ancestors who are also my earth ancestors, such that my earth ancestors experienced a great deal of suffering at the hands of the sky ancestors of these spiritual practitioners, which is to say concretely, and this more or less like corresponds to what I've heard directly from family members, is that one of my family members was said to have a quote golden skeleton unquote and became very sick. And then in order to try and remedy this illness, which was like not of a clearly like physical nature, she went to see many different like healers. Like some of them were shamanistic, some of them were like so-called Buddhists, some of them were kind of like shamanistic Buddhists. Um, and my sense was, before having heard too much about her story from members of my family, is that she had visited some Buddhist monks and that these Buddhist monks had in some way, I'll say shielding, abused her in order to cause her to suffer so that they could metaphysically burgle her earth ancestral akasha, which is to say that through that suffering she became disembodied, so there was quote nobody home unquote, so that they could go into her earth ancestral akasha, which is to say like the akashic records that she was connected to via her DNA, and they could take wisdom codes, which I've sometimes referred to as terma, from the earth ancestral akasha when she was disembodied, so that she was not aware enough to shield that. And I'll say that in East Asian folk medicine lineages, there is like a layer of the chi or the spirit body, which is called wei chi or wei qi, which is also referred to as shielding chi or encounter chi, which mostly emanates from the lower dantian, which is mostly, I'll say, irrigated and cultivated by our understanding of our earth ancestors and our clear connection to their karma, which can only be clear when we've released certain modes of karma. And I'll say that, like, my sense is that her connection to these earth ancestral wisdom codes was really clean. When she was disembodied, they were able to get access to these clean codes, which, were referred to as the quote golden skeleton, unquote. And it is my sense that the monks that did this were sky ancestors of these spiritual practitioners. And it is my sense that the etheric soul that occupied the vessel of my earth ancestor was part of my etheric soul complex and therefore part of my sky ancestry. And that the corporeal body of this earth ancestor of mine is obviously maybe part of my earth ancestry. So that the karma of these different lineages, as they were enacted through the ripening of the life forms of my spiritual practitioners, teachers, and my vessel, required me meeting these spiritual practitioners so that something could be resolved in the polarity that was created by this rupture, which was created when, you could say, the behavior of these Buddhist monks became part of the genetic code, or the etheric genetic code of their sky ancestors. And the suffering at the hands of these Buddhist monks became part of the etheric and corporeal genetic code of my sky ancestry and earth ancestry, respectively. And so that there needed to be some exchange in order to resolve that polarity that was created by that rupture between not only me and not only these spiritual practitioners that I learned from for a while, but anybody who represented those sky ancestries and earth ancestries, which I would say, like in my case, there are, I'll say, incarnations that I'm aware of that represent those earth ancestries. And there are incarnations that I'm aware of that represent those sky ancestries. But I believe that my incarnation is the only one that represents both those sky ancestries and earth ancestries. And I'll say that there are many people who represent the sky ancestries of the spiritual practitioners that I learnt with. But I'll say that within this time, within this timeline, within these choice lines, within these possibility planes, my encounter with these teachers allowed me to ripen the karma of these sky ancestries and earth ancestries. And I feel like I'm talking about like really complex and vast and dense stuff, so I'm going to hold space for questions just for a second. And I'm also going to tune into the containers of these questions to see if there's any, I'll say, like intelligence to harvest from them. So this says binary ancestral cultivation is what's coming through for me right now. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for offering that reflection. I guess like what I want to like harvest from this container as a whole, which includes the containers of these questions, is that somebody might say like, okay, this crazy guy pulled over off the freeway somewhere between the low deserts and the high deserts of Arizona and put a cup of coffee in a pile of cow dung and then danced around it. And then he says this shit happened. Why should I believe him? He's clearly unhinged. Which is like a fair interpretation, I would say, within, I would say, like the normative field of the collective of human consciousness. Because, like, not a lot of people do stuff like this. I'll say, like, not a lot of people do stuff like this and then talk about it in a way which is well grounded. And I would say more people do stuff like this and talk about it in ways that are not grounded. And I would say like a ton of people do stuff like this and don't talk about it in ways which are either grounded or ungrounded, which is why I would say the normative aspect of the field of collective human consciousness might feel like what I'm saying is pretty unhinged. But I guess what I feel called to offer to the container in order to build a bridge from my grounding in the field of collective human consciousness within the fabric of space and time, which relates to Earth, to the field of the normative aspect of the field of collective human consciousness, is that after having lightened myself of this like karmic burden, um, I would say that like my understanding of the experiences of this earth ancestor were corroborated or backed up by the stories that I heard from my own family members who remembered her lifetime, which you also don't have to believe. And, I haven't recorded it, I haven't committed it to um, paper, and I haven't had any like paper like notarized or, you know, committed to the process of creating an affidavit or anything like that. So you might say that's kind of flimsy evidence. But I guess I'll also say that I enrolled in classes which related to teachings of these spiritual practitioners without attending those classes, but I ended up doing a lot of things which were taught in those classes. And I believe that that dynamic arose because what they used to create these classes came from my akash of my earth ancestry. Um, which also you don't have to believe, right? Because you could also say that maybe I'm the one who metaphysically burgled their akashas, or maybe I metaphysically burgled their classes. Like they just had some way to get into the astral containers of the classes they created without attending them in the physical, so that I could do the things that they were teaching in those classes. Um, And I'll also say that my sense is that my vessel has the capability to do that. But I'll also say that perhaps the fact that I'm laying all of this out in the particular way that I'm laying it out um, builds some trust that what I'm saying is not necessarily true, because I don't think that's necessarily like operative or applicable. I feel like what I'm called to transmit is not like your belief that what I experienced is true, but rather, I would say, terma and terms which allow y'all to perceive your past and possible times that will arise in the future in ways that help you to become aware of the potential for metaphysical burglary, and also aware of tools that make sure that you are present so that burglary cannot occur, which is to say that you can be like integrated enough so that there aren't aspects of yourself when nobody is home, so to speak, so that people can take stuff from your akash of the earth ancestors or sky ancestors. But I also feel like what I'm sharing may cause people to reperceive what they've experienced in the past, which perhaps aligns somewhat with the shapes that I'm offering to this container. And I'll also say that I feel like other people have also already experienced and integrated reservoirs of time, which include experiences which overlap in dynamic or geometry with the experiences I've shared in this container. And I pray that what I offer to the field of collective human consciousness allows people to give breath or give voice to their experiences in ways that will help these spiritual practitioners ripen their karma without causing further rupture, not only for their vessels or incarnations, but for other vessels or incarnations, such as the ruptures that I know my vessel suffered from, such as the ruptures that I know other people have suffered from, um, and that we may ripen the karma of these earth ancestors and these sky ancestors in ways which are aligned with definitions of cosmic time. And with that, I'll close the container and thank you once again for your offerings of presence and questions. And I'll say like some of the offerings of some of your sky ancestors and earth ancestors, which allowed me to hold this portal. If you're listening asynchronously, I'll say thank you. And I'll say like the same dynamics apply even if you weren't here, which might bend your mind a little bit. I'll say if you would like to tune into these containers live, then please see the link to join the Discord, or you can hit thebroom.us and find links there to join the Discord. If you would like to support this offering, then you can see links in the description, which lead you to parts of my website where you can learn about how to book sessions with me or make donations either on a one-time or on a weekly or a monthly basis. There's also information there about joining the lineage space, which I call 000, which Why Am I Like This comes from. And I'll also say happy Women's History Month, no matter which space and time you're in when you listen to this. And I'll say peace. Thank you.